This discussion is about charting new horizons. What will it take to address systemic risk? We brought together a panel of experts to discuss how they approach systemic risk, navigate complexity, rethink governance structures, and redefine the roles of finance and civil society in today's shifting geopolitical landscape. We will explore the pressing need for integrated policies, resilience, and the opportunities that come from collaboration and a shared vision. Please welcome the panel with me as I transition over here. Okay, is this working? Yep, great. So our panel, furthest to my right, Catalina Jaime, Head of Climate and Conflict, Red Cross, Red Crescent Climate Center. We also have Jean-Francois Mercure. I hope I said that right. How's my French accent? Okay, good. Principal economist at Cambridge Econometrics and co-founder C3A, the Coalition on Capacity for Climate Action. Welcome, Jean-Francois. We also have Ayan Mahamoud, Senior Program Coordinator, Intergovernmental Authority on Development, also known as IGAD, and Laurent Bontoux, PolicyLab of Joint Research Center of the European Commission. So welcome all of you. I would like to start with a general question that I would like to address to each of you. And the question is, we're all living in a moment where the systems meant to support us, social, financial, political, environmental, are showing deep signs of strain. Trust is eroding. Risks are accelerating, compounding, and cascading. Some saying managing this polycrisis isn't enough. What will it take to meet this moment at the scale, scope, and speed required? And do you see bright spots of action? Catalina, let me start with you.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. I'm so delighted to be here, and I think Ruth and the team, the start of this has been absolutely beautiful. Like you and Ben and Christina, it's been really, I feel like butterflies all over me of excitement. So I think I have three key things, and I think we all know this is not a mystery. I think we seriously need bold action. Like we need particularly really bold investments that really help us to tackle the root causes of disasters. I love what Christina said about, we have all these big conventions. We need these big, bold actions to kind of break that and rethink how we can do the things differently. There is something really, really important is trust. So we need trust in people. We need trust that we can really make the change. Our dear colleague Pablo Suarez used to have this beautiful phrase that I think is so powerful and says change happens at the speed of trust. And I think that is just so important. If we really want to change the system, that's what we need. And I think really thinking about Ben last night, we really need to let our crazy imagination really flow as much as we can. If we really want to change the system, we need to let the craziest ideas really move forward, particularly to think on a world for the next 10 years, the 100 years, the 1,000 years, because at the end, bottom line, we just need to be good ancestors. That's what we need to be. And that's the way how we can change the things now. I think there are some really bright spots that kind of gives me happiness and hope of seeing how the systems are changing. I think the work of Kate Raworth with the dawn of the economics and trying really to change the system and kind of nurturing that new generation of economists that will think differently, that hopefully will be the ministries of finances very soon. I think that's so powerful. And within the humanitarian sector, there is something very special that is happening. A person called Hugo Slim, who is this hardcore, old-school humanitarian, amazing. He has changed totally his discourse in a way that he's listening to indigenous communities, to so many people, to really think that the humanitarian sector should change to not only take care about humans, but to take about the ecosystems that we live in. And that's very powerful, within that humanitarian sphere. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. And thank you for mentioning economists, because that's a perfect segue to Jean-Francois. Jean-Francois, how do we meet this moment?
Yeah, okay. I Well, I don't know the answer, but I would say, so I was for a little while at the World Bank and can make some observations. As what I've seen, we were developing a program to engage with Ministry of Finance and build capacity to address questions around climate change and systemic risks. And I think most of the time, if we asked countries what they wanted, I don't think they were able to give us a very clear answer as to what they thought the capacities were needed that they would like to develop. To some degree, understanding the systemic risk is not really there. And so just building that capacity is probably the most important thing we could be doing. But beyond that is the capacity to act on systemic risks and mitigating, but also transforming systems. That's also not clear. So what do they need to do exactly? I think that the understanding is not there. And to some degree, perhaps this engagement as we've got here could really make, I think, a big difference to bring forward that understanding and capacity to act.
Great, fantastic. Thank you. Ayan, over to you. How do you see things from your spot of the world?
Thank you, Ruth, for again another hard question. You asked about a few things: the scale, the speed, and the bright spots that, in terms of the wisdom and the learning from our side. One aspect that you're absolutely right is that, and Christina also said, managing is no longer enough. And in my part of the world, the Horn of Africa, we've learned this the very hard way. When you have droughts and conflict and economic collapse that hit community simultaneously, our traditional ways of crisis management become almost irrelevant. It was for us. It felt like a game of whack-a-mole, like bit one after the other. You stabilize one crisis, and then two more just emerge. What it took us and what it takes at scale, what's required, I would say anticipatory governance. No longer the type of reactive management that we've been doing. I would say system redesign, and I think that's also where we agree a lot with Christiana in terms within our multilateral institution. We no longer need system repair. We really need to redesign, and the scale can now be defined. I would say regional solution for problems that laugh at borders, and this is where I miss Pablo, because I'm sure he would have had a blast in our conversation. The bright spots. Where in IGAD are we getting ahead of the curve? Early warning as early action, and I think Catalina would also agree that we really are getting better at predicting droughts. But not only are we getting better at predicting it, we also are able to trigger automatic financing, prepositioning of resources, and coordination, cross-border coordination before people start losing. There's a loss of life and livelihood. So we are slowly moving, but we are moving from early warning, late response to early warning, early action. The second aspect that I'd like to talk about in terms of bright spots is the seizing the opportunity, transforming crisis into integration. The COVID-19 pandemic that could have shattered our region. Instead, we used it to harmonize health protocol. Eventually we closed our border, but we were still able to set cross-border management and build what we would use as joint procurement system at the region. So that crisis for us became a catalyst for deeper integration. And then communities. I mean, the last aspect is community-led resilience. I know we've talked a lot about community, and I'm sure we're going to continue talking a lot more about the community. But with our pastoral community, we are not imposing solution. We really are scaling up their knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and now integrating more and more the traditional indigenous practice in terms of early warning system with satellite data. And lastly, I'm sorry, to say 2 minutes. That's the problem with politicians. The speed and the scope we need. In terms of speed, what we say, like we no longer wait for the perfect data or the complete consensus. We opted to operate for a good enough information and fast enough action. And that means for us activating all those systems within hours of early warning. The scope, I had to check with Kasia. This is not a Chatham House rule, so I have to mind what I'm saying. But we stopped pretending that national government alone can solve systemic problems. And we're not saying that just because, I mean, it's just a bunch of words that do not make sense. It really took a whole paradigm shift with governments to understand that resilience involves everyone from village elders to development banks. And I would love to have follow-on conversation with anybody who is from the development bank in this auditorium. Right. For the global conversation, I would say adaptive capacity over rigid planning, and it's amazing how this resonates with other colleagues. I would say network resilience over institutional hierarchy, and then community agency over expert solution. My bottom line on this one, it's that whichever way you look at it, the scale, the scope, the speed required aren't just about resources. They are about fundamentally reimagining how we govern in an age of permanent complexity.
Thank you, Ayan. Laurent, how about you? How do we meet this moment?
Thank you very much, Ruth, and thank you very much for having invited me here today. I'm really happy to be in the middle of many like-minded people who really start to grapple these issues, head on. So I think we're living a bit in a paradoxical period, because at the time where we have mounting knowledge and mounting evidence of all these systemic crises and all these problems, we see a reversing of policies in many countries, which were inching forward in the right direction. So that's really something that we need to reflect on. And I think that when we use the word polycrisis, I think we have to be mindful that it tends to refer us towards the old or the current system. It's a crisis of the current system. And I think we need to really think about reflecting on where we want to go to, rather than trying to fix or, address the crisis of the old system, because the old system in the end is what actually brought us to the predicament we are facing. So I was really glad to hear Ben Okri last night, who told us to put humans at the core, to use and develop our imagination, to build visions, and essentially, to also use lots of love, to move forward. I think these 3 points were absolutely fundamental. And I think this is putting us, civil servants in general, and EU civil servants in particular, in front of very huge responsibilities. So in that context, I think a couple of bright spots can be seen. On the one hand, I think what is clear from what we've heard, yesterday and this morning already, we have enough knowledge and enough technologies, I think, to move forward in the right direction. So, we have a lot of potential to do the right thing. We have the capacity. So how do we mobilize them? That's the question. Another bright spot, I think, if I look at the EU in particular, we start to see the emergence of policies that put humans at the core. So we have, for example, the EU initiative on Industry 5.0, where the whole point is to put the people at the core, not just the productivity. And I was reading this morning in some news that, there is still progress being made in the EU in terms of decarbonization, for example. So in spite of the reversal of some policies, there's still progress being made. And I think I'll close on the fact that we start to understand better also the principles of governance in complexity. What we've just heard from all of us here now is that we have to grapple with complexity. And we still start to understand, you know, the principles of care, the principles of participation, the principle of anticipation, you know, really taking a forward look to move forward in these systemic approaches. And then I think a final bright spot I want to mention is actually this initiative, now, us, today. You know, we see that there's no easy fix solution, but because we are in a post-normal world, because there's not the solution, you know, or the position paper, as you were saying yesterday, Ruth, you know, to write, we need to have a dynamic discussion platform like this, you know, that we need to maintain, keep alive, to keep reflecting on our predicament, to keep finding the imagination, creating the visions for moving forward, and developing the collective intelligence we need to actually create a sustainable future.
Great, thank you, Laurent. Let me flip back over here to Catalina. The humanitarian system, where you work, is stretched to its limits, as we know. And it's often called on to respond to the consequences of deeper structural failures. What does it take to move from reactive relief to truly anticipatory systemic action, especially for the most vulnerable?
So, as you probably all know, the humanitarian system is really in trouble. Like, I have been a humanitarian worker over the last 21 years, although I know I look very young, but it's 21 years. And I had never seen really something like this. I have been in different crises in Haiti and Philippines and in my own country, Colombia, and it's just we haven't really seen. And the reality is that it's not only because of the financial crisis that we're facing because of USAID, and it really is structural, and we have known this already for quite some time. So I want you to think for a second, like what do you think are the reasons why we have this existential crisis in the humanitarian sector? So for me, there are three main things. There are many, but there are like three key things that I want to highlight. So one is because the humanitarian system, like it has elements of duplication. We have an issue of territoriality. And also there is a lack of coordination. Like we are not really coordinating our interventions. We're trying to be better and we have been really trying, but we still have those operational, structural issues. But it is also a rigid system in a way that still focuses in individual responses. So we respond to the flood, we respond to the drought, we respond to the conflict, but we don't really respond to the kind of systematic issue that is happening. But I think fundamentally, one of the things that we see is that we are seeing the impacts of systemic crisis. Like we are seeing them there before our eyes. There is like one very concrete example, which I think is just illustrates this very well. So you might remember that in India and Pakistan, there was a heat wave in 2022. And it was just right after the escalation of the war in Ukraine and Russia. So as you probably remember, Ukraine is one of the biggest producers of wheat in the world. So of course, because we were not able to access to that wheat because there were very high prices and they were not exporting, the second country that produces the most is India. But because India was facing the impacts of that heat wave and then a cascading drought, the government decided to do a ban on exports to make sure that prices were controlled in the country. So what happened to the humanitarian sector? We had to basically couldn't buy it as much as we could. The prices were super high, and that had a gigantic impact in the Horn of Africa, where there was a crisis that was happening there because of the combination of conflict and climate and many, many other factors. So we see this, like how all these interconnections and how we are seeing those impacts in the humanitarian sector. One of my favorite singers called Jorge Drexler has this beautiful song that is called Todo se transforma. And it's just about like how all transform into one thing and the other and the other and the other. So now, what do we do? I mean, there are things that we definitely can do to change this. So I have like 4 things that really came to my mind and resonate to a lot of the conversations that we had and to Ben and others. So I think we need a post-aid, post-humanitarian imagination system. In a way, I feel that we need to kind of forget the ways how we're working and kind of rethink totally, and how do we do this in a new way that really accounts from these interconnections between the humans and nature and governance and power dynamics, and like really try to think. So there are some interesting movements in the humanitarian sector, happening together, but we're not quite yet getting there. I think something so important is science. I think there is so much progress that is happening. Something that really excites me quite a lot in the world of forecasting, for example, the power of AI for the future of forecasting. That's big. It's big. It's going to really change radically. Like the investments that are happening at the moment on that are huge. So we need to be ready for that. Like I think Ayan, you were saying, no, like how good are we becoming on anticipating crisis? So I think it's going to get better if we use science properly. But I think something that really resonates to this event is that need to really integrate the multiple knowledge systems in our decision-making processes. So really kind of bring those diverse disciplines. And I think this event is just so perfect for that. I mean, just in half a day, I have had conversations with like the most multidisciplinary type of themes. And I think that's the way for us to change how we're doing risk analytics. Like if we don't really get out and talk to people that is outside of our normal bubble, we won't do the risk analytics that will help us to take the decisions that we need to take. And I think last, very importantly, and kind of going back to the aspect of like trust. So we really require to have trust at different levels. And I think very, very importantly to have that trust in the people that is at the front lines of these systemic impacts. And I think I work a lot on the intersection between climate and conflict, and like trusting on those populations that are affected by war, by the horrors of war. They know the solutions, they know the dynamics, so we need to trust on those solutions that they are putting forward. But as a whole, I think, and this is really resonating with what like Ben was saying yesterday, we need to trust in us, in humanity as a whole, to really be able to, have a world with like justice and dignity and the well-being that we all need.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Jean-Francois, you work in a very different world. You work in the world of finance and climate. So my question for you is, what's one bold shift you'd like to see financial institutions and governments make to address the poly crisis? And how can the two work together to build long-term economic and financial resilience?
Right, okay, well, I wish I knew the answer, but I'll try to say a few intelligent things. I think maybe many people don't realize, to face the poly crisis and, say, climate change takes quite a bit of capacity, and we don't have a lot of capacity in the system. So similarly to the discussion about humanitarian systems just now, is the capacity of the financial system to absorb a rapid transition, for instance. I think that's a good question. So the big thing to do would be to build up systemic resilience to be able to withstand the stress that a rapid transformation towards achieving our goals would entail. So what's the resilience of the current system? So I think it's very low in many respects. So if we have for instance, really rapid shift to low carbon technologies, that's going to destroy a lot of financial value in the high carbon systems naturally. It's part of what we want to do, but is the financial system able to withstand that loss of value very suddenly without there being a financial crisis or a lot of instability? That is a big question. The transition is capital intensive, which means the financial system has to grow and lend a lot more. And is the system able to do this sustainably? There's an issue where at the outset of COVID, there's been an overhang of debt for many developing countries, which leads them to be in a state of slight paralysis because the fiscal space is nearly zero in terms of external debt, and they could be close to a currency crisis. And then there's a climate crisis that gradually erodes resilience. So I think there exists a trade-off between efficiency and resilience. For the last 50 years, economic ideology has been focused on the idea of efficiency. But I think we see now that we've ended up with a very fragile world that's got a lot of concentrated problems in different places. Just for instance, the IT supply chain being all based in Taiwan is not a very good thing. So rapid economic transformation will be very difficult, maybe impossible, if we start off from this point of low capacity, low resilience to be able to withstand the stress. and we continue to build systems that are fragile out of looking for efficiency. So the big step that I think needs to be taken is, first, we need to know how resilient are we. So central banks do this now by doing stress tests. I think this is good because that's a measurement of resilience. We need to do a lot more of that sort of thing, a bit more broadly outside just the remit of central banks. Is the action we're planning to take itself resilient, or are we going to just end up with policy reversals? And we just keep seeing policy reversals quite consistently with every change of governments in some countries. And lastly, and most importantly, I suppose, is the future we're trying to create resilient? For instance, if we create a future that's got more inequality than the current situation, then that's a future with less legitimacy, and so it's a future that's almost certainly going to have policy reversals and people just being against transformation, and then we end up maybe with people voting for populist governments and so on, and again in a state of paralysis. So we need to create systems that have resilience in order for them to be able to stay in place.
So, capacity and resilience, fantastic. Thank you so much. Ayan, again, you work in a very different context. You operate in a region where climate collapse, conflict, and forced displacement are not abstract concepts. They're daily realities. What lessons can regional cooperation in the Horn of Africa offer a world that's waking up to systemic risk thinking, but still struggling to act together?
Thank you again for
a tough question.
Yes. I would say about three or four lessons. The first one was that crisis forces innovation. We had a very blunt awakening and a stark reality check when we've had a huge number of people in our region that are faced with acute food insecurity just last year alone because of the intersection of conflict and drought and economic shocks and economic shocks that are not even from our region. I mean, you heard Catalina. And for us, what we found, what we woke up to is that systemic risk wasn't a concept. And from thereafter, it really forced a different kind of a thinking. While we lived for decades in what we've learned about systemic risk is that what works when systems are collapsing around you. So I would say crisis. The crisis that forces innovation for us. What we created after 2011, and 2011 for us was a year of famine in the Horn, is that what we created was an integrated early warning system. Integrated how because we couldn't afford to get surprised again, we had to overlay information such as standard climate with conflict, movement of people, area of food reserve, and etc. And what works is that when survival is at stake, bureaucratic barriers disappeared overnight. We learn to prototype fast and fail fast. We actually accepted failure and scale up what worked immediately. The second lesson that we've learned is that traditional systems are often more resilient than the modern one. It's true, our government struggled with border control during COVID, but yet pastoralist community maintain a local food system across the countries. And they did that using a traditional governance structure that are centuries old. The lesson from that is that we just don't build new systems. We understand and we strengthen existing ones. We don't destroy them. from there, we accepted that our most successful program would be the one that combined traditional governance system with modern technology. The third one was that shared vulnerability creates shared solutions. And that, we worked kind of counterintuitive, isn't it? Where we see our greatest weakness being that problem in one country immediately affect others. And that has become our greatest strength for cooperation. Until COVID, or rather until Ukraine and India, where we realized that the geographic scale is not the same anymore. Now it's kind of moved me to what Catalina was describing, and the greatest sources of my frustration in 2022 when we first met is that what happened in other parts of the region at global level kind of have disastrous effects. So we have to move out a little bit more and I don't, zoom in or zoom out, I don't know. What works with us is that we understood mutual dependence. We linked that with shared identity, and then we linked that to dealing with common threats. We're no longer talking about just climate change, but also how economic volatility in other parts of the region affects our quality of life in the Horn. The lessons here that I would probably propose is that we should stop trying to solve global problems with national tools and kind of build institutions around shared vulnerabilities, not only shared interest or even special interest, because I think special interest is still trapping our multilateral environment. In terms of integration, and that's the fourth and last lesson, I would say we found out that integration happens through practice, not politics. We looked a lot at the EU model and the Brussels model, and that for us didn't work. In terms of regional integration, there are parts we really end up contextualizing the EU model of the formal integration approach, treaties and protocols and institutional framework, and it was really slow progress. I mean, it was really slow because political sovereignty still dominates, and we're moving away. I'm sure you've noticed we're moving away, and I'm scared of that we will end up discarding multilateralism and come back to isolationist policies and etc. or protectionist policies. But what actually works for us is functional integration. For example, M-Pesa, which is mobile money, ended up connecting our economies faster than trade agreements. Yeah. Women, and I don't think we've talked a lot about the role of women in solving crisis and strengthening system. Cross-border trade, literally informal cross-border trade prospered during COVID, because women traders, they've created the most resilient supply chain in the region. And that operates through families, clan network, and it really pacifies the region. And the lessons for me there is that integration can only happen when people come together to solve real problems together, not when politicians sign agreements. That's just the fallacy of our own policy work. What the world can learn from my part of the region, 3 actionable insights that I'd like to share with you is start with shared vulnerabilities, not shared values. Of course, shared values help. I'm sure we do have kindness and loves and all of that. That's really important. But shared vulnerabilities kind of build cooperation, strengthen the cooperation around shared threats, rather than trying to align political system. We will need to work with China, for example. That's what we mean by shared vulnerability. Yeah. Combine traditional and modern system. The most resilient system from our perspective really combines wisdom indigenous wisdom, ancient wisdom, with new technology. We can't just, we shouldn't replace existing network. We should work on upgrading them. And then we should let crisis, whichever crisis we're facing, drive innovation. So we shouldn't wait for the perfect condition to start regional cooperation, for example. We should use the next crisis to be as an opportunity to be transformative and to build better system together. I would say, I would close with one
Final
word.
point, yeah, that would be good.
What that one. We should be ready to think and act like systems. Even at country level, not only nations, but really have the political view of moving as systems.
Fantastic. Thank you, Ayan. Catalina spoke about imagination, and maybe this connects, Laurent, to your work on foresight and futures. Many institutions still respond to today's crises with yesterday's tools, shaped by short-term pressures and political cycles. How can foresight become more than just a planning tool and shift how decisions are made today? And can you provide an example or two?
Thanks a lot, Ruth. You like to ask very easy questions, right? Actually, first I'm going to spend a few seconds rebounding on what something that Jean-Francois just said. You know, the trade-off between efficiency and resilience. You know, working in foresight, I'm starting to see, so I mean, as an engineer, I've understood this trade-off a long time ago, but working in foresight, I'm starting to see resilience as actually the long-term efficiency. The efficiency of long-term is resilience. Efficiency is usually something we focused on very, very short-term. Anyway, but to answer your question, Ruth, I think that this is indeed, you know, something that we see regularly, you know, people trying to solve new issues using old tools. And we see that in the European Commission, even if the European Commission has started to work on this through its better regulation approach. Because finally, there is a realization that we need to engage in what people call anticipatory policy making or anticipatory governance, you know, that really calls for foresight to really improve policy making. I don't think we can escape the presentism, you know, which is what we call presentism, you know, created by the crisis, the call for the present, you know, the call for the short term, you know, to solve some issues. But at the same time, in that context, it's even more important to build futures literacy, to build capacity to do foresight exercises, to run foresight processes, and to stop people looking at fixing the past, but building the future. You know, when we think about crisis, when we think about even polycrisis, sometimes we tend to look back, you know, and trying to fix, you know, what was broken. But the thing is, the old systems are the ones that brought us into our predicament today. So we really have to look forward and to find tools to help people develop this culture of looking forward and building this imagination and this vision that Ben was talking about yesterday. So that's where it brings us again to resilience, you know, which is the capacity to do exactly this, is to not get back to the previous state, but maintain our course towards the future and towards a positive future. And foresight processes can help us, and foresight literacy actually can help us to build desirable visions. And foresight actually helps deepen this capacity to build visions because it can help people imagine alternative possible futures, so explore the range of what is possible, which is quite necessary to think in systems and to reflect back about, okay, among these possible futures, which are the ones which are desirable and that we would like to achieve, you know, and then thanks to the participation, thanks to collective intelligence, thanks to actually sharing these discussions over time, you know, help some shared understanding of where we want to go together towards the future. So to be practical, I will illustrate what we do at the PolicyLab in this respect, you know, with 3 examples. I think the first example I want to take is the foresight work that we did to prepare the strategic foresight report of the European Commission in 2023. So there we build a set of scenarios And we provided the Commission with a systemic look at how the EU could become sustainable. And we identified 11 key strategic areas of intervention, okay? And I think the main underlying messages of this work were two, you know? The first one was that in order for the Commission or the European Union or whatever group of countries to move towards sustainability, we need to take policy actions across these 11 key areas of intervention in a coordinated way. You know, so this systemic approach, you know, was really inherent to this. For this coherence to emerge, it is really useful to have a long-term vision, because otherwise, if you don't have an idea of where you want to get at in the future, how do we create the coherence of policy action across all these very different areas, or areas that appear to be very disconnected, but actually they are not, as we were hearing from all of us here. I think the second one is the work we are doing actually right now to help our colleagues in the Secretariat General to write this year's Commission Strategic Foresight Report, whose theme is resilience. So we had a whole discussion over the last few months, you know, trying to understand resilience as distinct from preparedness. Very often people think preparedness and resilience are the same, but actually they're not, because very often preparedness is about fixing the known unknowns, you know, and getting ready for what we can expect. But with resilience, we need to go beyond this, because the systems are so complex, the changes are so fast and so broad, we cannot know what's going to happen completely. So we need to also develop this anticipatory side beyond preparedness to actually build resilience. And the third example I want to take is just a proof of how concrete and down to earth we are sometimes at the EU PolicyLab, and it's our crisis exploration workshop tool. So based on the work we did last year, where we identified a number of risks, you know, 40 risks, we discovered that there was a need for people to actually, in practice, get, you know, through the mental exercise of combining risks coming from very different areas. You know, Ayan was just telling us, you know, that all of a sudden something happens, and then 2 or 3 other things apparently unconnected also happen, and then people are taken aback. So this kind of tools, you know, in a half-day workshop, help people come to grips with this, so that when this happens in real life, you know, the mental gymnastics is already there. You know, they're better ready to engage in reacting, you know, to what happens in a more proactive way, if I may speak like this. So anyway, so that's a few things I want to say just now.
Thank you. I mean, amazing experience, expertise, insight here. Let's take a couple of questions from the audience. We have a microphone roaming, I think. I see one hand there.
Thank you.
And please, if you could just say your name.
Sure.
And keep your question short and snappy. And
Exactly.
yeah, please, thank you.
Thank you. Georgios Kostakos from FOGS, the Foundation for Global Governance and Sustainability. We talk a lot about resilience. We have proposed the Global Resilience Council to think for the globe for the main threats, risks. But when you talk about resilience from smaller level individual organizations, for me, the resilience of the global financial system as it now stands is bad for the world. So I would not, the solution may be somewhere else. For example, for the humanitarian sector, the resilience of the people could come from development and not from the humanitarian sector itself. So how can we really broaden this to the human being? Because as our poet said yesterday, imagination is not good or bad, it's how you use it. Resilience is also not good or bad, but where do you place the conceptual framework and the institutional framework to be, for everybody, I hope, good and resilient, what we do? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let's take another question. Let's take 3, and then we'll have the panelists respond. Yeah, there's a question over here.
Hi, my name is Juliette. I work for the Realliance Network. It's very heartwarming to hear language I've been using from the margins for a long time to be used from quite large organizations and quite influential people. But when human beings, myself included, are afraid, They are not kind, they don't trust, and they're not inclusive. Ayan touched on this, but I'd be very keen to hear from other members of the panel what we do about that.
Thank you. One more question here.
This symposium is delightful, and I've had many interesting conversations, and the panel has spoken a language that is very palpable and immediate to me. Pardon me, I'll introduce myself. Yes. Stephen Popper from the Tecnológico de Monterrey in Mexico. My problem is this. How do we frame a language that goes beyond our circle? How do we talk to people about precisely the issues that the panel has engaged in a language that is going to be immediate to people who, ordinarily would not come to a meeting like this, or, are facing considerable fear, uncertainty, and therefore unwillingness to change because they don't know that the future change will not be worse for them?
Great. Thank you for those questions. In the interest of time, what I'm going to do is just go one by one, 1 minute short response to whichever question you'd like her to respond to. And if the question doesn't get answered, of course, hopefully we have time over breaks and lunch, et cetera, for people to continue to discuss. But 1 minute answer to any of those questions. Laurent, I'll start with you.
Okay, thank you very much. So that's an interesting group of questions. So very briefly, what I want to do is actually call on the work published by the European Environment Agency last year on governance and complexity. I was mentioning this because here you have the principles of anticipation, the principles of participation at the same time. And I think that engaging and applying these principles is going to be very important to address actually all the questions at the same time, because we need to be able to talk to everybody, to share this, or to stimulate this imagination and build these shared visions, and build also the collective intelligence that goes with it. Because by engaging people at all different levels of governance or of life, we can address, this fear, for example, thanks to imagination, because we can help people imagine positive futures, and we can help people share, the bright spots we were trying to mention earlier. And I think that applying these principles of governance and complexity in our post-normal world is really going to be very important. But I know that very often this doesn't appear as efficient in terms of governance, because it takes time and effort. You have to go everywhere, talk with everybody. I mean, it is messy, it's expensive, and so people are reluctant to do this for the sake of expediency. But I think in the predicament we are now, we cannot avoid this.
Fantastic, thank you. Ayan, 1 minute.
All right. I'll have that conversation with you, George, over lunch, because Ruth is ruthless. But I would like to address Stephen's question. How do we frame whatever we're talking about in a language that is palpable to others? That's the hardest part of our work. Because, I'm sure in this board auditorium, we're still among peers, people who understand exactly what for a system would be, and DMDU, and would be able to understand all those different definitions. But taking that leap require for us to be fearless in such a way that this is an uncomfortable conversation, and then you continue. You persist in it, say, okay, but what does that mean to you? And continue asking and trying to frame that conversation in such a way that the person understands what trigger their interest, and what would be, for example, a good entry point for you to be, for them to be able to understand where you're coming from. One of the points that I made was we ought to have a deeper conversation with development banks. If I ask, like show of a hand, how many are from either World Bank, African Development Bank, any financial system? Thank you. I will have a conversation with you later on. Because, yes, because they're still funding silos. They're not, although they are the best part of, they understand what risk is, and complex risk, and systems, but they're very uncomfortable venturing into that.
Another lunchtime conversation.
Exactly.
Fantastic. Jean-Francois, please, 1 minute.
Yeah, okay. I think perhaps I understood the question as what individuals could do in this situation of systemic risk or individual institutions. There's a good example of this happening. So it's collective movement that leads to addressing risks. So there was the banks that got together to form the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Disclosures, that had recommendations that have actually made their way to become a standard practice in the IFRS guidelines for reporting. And that's important because it generated a ton of data over what companies are doing, what their impact on climate change is, and actually their climate-related risks, which is the main goal of doing that. And then it becomes a lot clearer what the systemic risk is. So in that way, people got together. It's not clear yet what you do with all this. I mean, there's not that much policy yet, but I mean, it's a good start. And on the fear point, I think being uninformed is what leads to there being a lot of fear, and then people sort of not knowing what to do what they can and respond to that fear. So a lot of it comes to communication and better understanding the complexity of systems and trying to communicate that properly.
Fantastic, thank you. Catalina, you get the last word, 1 minute.
Thank you. So a bit related to your question, Stevens, I thought about Pablo again, and he used to say this very famously, that showing research is not really useful to really make the changes that we need in people. We understood that very well at the Climate Center. We have a bunch of scientists and we produce incredible things, but we realized that we are not going to change the Crescent movement just showing research or going to communities showing research. So we really need to take an approach that really hits you deep down, that really moves your fibers. And I think a lot of the work of like, how do we get really that communication and that action is through absolutely alternative ways, like you probably have seen. Like one of the latest things that we're started to use in the Climate Center was the use of acrobatics to talk about how do we manage like risk, or the use of humor as well, to, like get, in a kind of different type of feeling, to have conversations that we normally wouldn't have if it was not through a type of humor. And games. Ultimately, games have become like this really important tool to open up, to just break the ice and let people really be open. So I think that definitely, for us to be able to have that communication, to really have those minimal changes, we really need to look at those alternative ways of like, how do we communicate.
Fantastic, thank you. So much more we could explore. Let's leave it there. Big round of applause to our fabulous panelists for sharing their expertise and wisdom. Thank you so much, and lots of grist for the mill for conversations over break and lunch. So thank you again.